Hey everyone, welcome to today's Explainer. So, today we are doing something a little different. We're performing a clinical diagnosis on a massive, undeniable geopolitical shift. We are diving deep into the systemic breakdown of the European economy. We're going to unpack some absolutely fascinating and, frankly, kind of startling source material that diagnoses what it calls the 7 fatal wounds currently bleeding out the continent's economic vitality. We're going to map this all out, layer by layer, so we can understand exactly how an entire economic empire actually begins to falter.
To really get this, we actually need to rewind a bit, all the way back to 1853. Picture this. Tsar Nicholas I is sitting across from a British ambassador, and he just offhandedly refers to the Ottoman Empire as the sick man of Europe. Well, that phrase stuck like a curse, and 65 years later, that empire was entirely gone. This sets up a really vital historical framework for us, which is that empires and economic titans, they don't just die overnight from a single bad quarter or one lost battle. They collapse from a century of compounding, systemic decisions that slowly make survival impossible.
Now, here's where it gets chilling. That infamous title has ominously shifted from the Ottomans in the 19th century to modern Europe today. Just like the multi-generational failure to adapt that completely doomed the Ottomans, our source material argues that Europe is facing a very similar fate, primarily through structural deindustrialization and totally stagnant productivity. It's a striking parallel, and it perfectly sets the stage for everything we're about to uncover.
Okay, here is our medical chart for this explainer. 1. The new sick man. 2. Draining capital and energy. 3. Industry and demographic collapse. 4. The regulation and defense trap. 5. The fatal productivity infection. And finally, 6. An obituary in advance. Let's get right into it.
Section 1. The new sick man. Myth versus reality.
So there's a really stark contrast between the comforting mainstream narrative we hear all the time and the harsh reality on the ground. The mainstream story basically acts like a sedative. You know the one. It says Europe simply chose lifestyle over hyper-growth, preferring 6 weeks of vacation and good espresso over a slightly bigger house. But the reality presented in our source material, it's so much darker than that. Europe isn't just resting. It is actively bleeding out from 7 self-inflicted wounds that have been compounding for decades.
Section 2. Draining capital and energy. Wounds 1 and 2.
Think about wound 1 like this, because the dark irony of where the money actually goes is wild. Let's follow the steps. A German dentist puts her hard-earned savings into her pension fund. Now, because Europe still lacks a truly integrated capital market, that money gets routed through a Dublin investment vehicle, crosses the Atlantic, and ends up funding a massive data center in Texas that's running the newest AI chips. And then, a German hospital literally licenses those exact same AI tools back at a premium. European savings are actively funding their own American competition. Europe generates the capital, America actually uses it.
The crucial point here is the sheer scale of this capital flight. 300 billion euros. That much money leaves the continent every single year. We are talking about an entire Netherlands' worth of capital vanishing annually just to buy American tech stocks and fund foreign startups. And of course, that starves Europe of the exact domestic investment it desperately needs to grow. And this feeds right into wound number 2, the energy lobotomy. Look at the timeline. Back in 2011, Germany abruptly shifted away from nuclear power and started shutting down perfectly good reactors. To fill that massive energy gap, they doubled down on cheap Russian gas. But when the 2022 invasion of Ukraine triggered that huge gas cutoff, wholesale energy prices completely exploded. The end result? By 2026, German industrial output had dropped roughly 14% from its peak.
Section 3. Industry and demographic collapse. Wounds 3 and 4.
Okay, we really need to define deindustrialization clearly here, because it gets thrown around a lot. This isn't just a bad economic quarter. It's a sticky, irreversible process. When skyrocketing energy prices force a factory to pack up and move to China or the US, it does not come back when those prices eventually drop. Those supply chains reroute permanently. And honestly, the most devastating part is that the generational engineering skills just die, because the next wave of apprentices never gets trained.
And we are seeing this vividly right now in what the source material calls the Mittelstand massacre. The foundational pillars of the whole European export miracle are either migrating or just dying in public. You've got BASF moving a $10 billion chemical complex straight to China, Volkswagen, for the very first time in its 87-year history, prepping home factory closures. Absolute industrial titans like ThyssenKrupp and Bosch shedding thousands of jobs. Every single layoff there is essentially a funeral for a highly specialized trade skill that won't be replaced.
Now, compounding all that industrial bleeding is wound 4, the demographic cliff. Look at this number, 370,000. That is the total number of births in Italy in 2024. That is the lowest in its entire history, literally lower than during World War II. Meanwhile, up in Germany, the baby boomer generation is retiring en masse. We're talking about 5 million more Germans exiting the workforce than entering it over a single decade. The workforce is literally walking off the field.
So this forces us to ask a surgical, totally mathematical question. European pensions are pay-as-you-go, meaning today's workers fund today's retirees. Now that works out just fine when you have 4 workers for every 1 retiree. But how on earth do you fund it when that ratio drops to 2 to 1? The math just straight up stops working. It threatens to break a generational social contract that's existed for well over a century.
Section 4. The Regulation and Defense Trap, Wounds 5 and 6.
The regulatory reality here is honestly staggering. As of the data from our source, Europe has exactly 1 tech firm worth over $100 billion. 1. It's ASML. Meanwhile, the US has an $11 trillion tech sector. Why the massive gap? Well, European firms spend triple the percentage of their revenue on regulatory compliance compared to American firms. It's a preemptive regulatory reflex that essentially taxes European startups out of existence, forcing them to reincorporate in Delaware just so they can scale and survive. They're regulating potential futures before they even arrive, and then wondering why the future ends up arriving somewhere else.
And neutrally examining Wound 6, the defense bankruptcy, let's just look at the actual production capacity for 155mm artillery shells back in 2022. The entire EU combined could produce about 300,000 a year. Russia? They were producing roughly 2 million, and the US completely tripled its output in just 18 months. Decades of fragmented, localized national procurement created an industrial base that just couldn't scale. So Europe woke up one day and realized it was basically renting a security architecture from America that it could no longer afford to rent.
Section 5. The Fatal Productivity Infection, Wound 7.
All right, this brings us to arguably the most vital piece of data in our entire explainer. Between the years 2000 and 2024, U.S. labor productivity grew by roughly 70%. European productivity grew just 20%. That staggering 50-point compounding gap, that's the exact reason why a European worker today earns about 30% less than an American counterpart doing the exact same job.
So the huge takeaway here is that productivity is fundamentally cultural. Europe has kind of fossilized its own economy by starving capital investment, dragging its feet on tech adoption, and most critically, rejecting creative destruction. That's the necessary, sometimes brutal process of letting old, inefficient firms actually die so that new, efficient ones can rise up. Because if nothing is allowed to die, nothing new ever gets the resources to grow.
Section 6. An obituary in advance. The closing loop.
What we're looking at right here is the literal anatomy of a doom loop. Step 1, a shrinking workforce fundamentally shrinks the tax base. Step 2, that directly leads to less investment and even lower productivity. Step 3, lower productivity causes shrinking wages. And step 4, those shrinking wages cause your most ambitious youth to just pack up and emigrate, which feeds right back into step 1. These 7 wounds reinforce each other, tightening the rope with every single turn of the cycle.
This brings us to what might be the most profound takeaway from the source material. It's this stark warning. Wealth is not a stock, it's a flow. Europe had the highest stock of accumulated wealth on Earth back in 2000, yet it fell visibly behind the US in just 25 years, without a single major war or natural disaster on its soil. Accumulated wealth acts exactly like a lit candle. It requires the continuous oxygen of productivity to survive. If you take away the oxygen, the candle still looks perfectly fine, right up until the moment it goes out.
So, we want to leave you with this final, provocative thought. When you step back and look at the shifting global landscape, and you really absorb the data we've just unpacked together, can a civilization actually survive when it flat out refuses to adapt, invest, and compete? Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope this breakdown has given you a powerful, sharp new lens for viewing the global economy.